I'm Michael Dawe, and I'm a local historian. One of the things I get asked a lot about are the history of the First Nations, the Aboriginal peoples of this part of the world. And quite often I get asked, well, whose territory was it? Who controlled or who owned this area? And that's really, in a lot of respects, a misleading question, because First Nations didn't really have the ideas of territoriality, the imaginary lines on the countryside that the Europeans did, or modern North Americans. They were hunter-gatherers. They went wherever hunting was good, where the food supply was reliable, or they could get water or shelter. So there was a constant movement. And so in this part of Central Alberta, at any given time you would have found First Nations people of just about all kinds of backgrounds and languages in the area. In a broad brush point of way, of course, of the millennia of which people have inhabited this area, a lot there's no record of other than spotty archaeological records, so we don't necessarily know a lot. But in terms of written historical record, we do know that in the early 1700s that the group that predominated in this area were what today we would call the Shoshone or Snake Indians. Unfortunately, they suffered greatly from one of the so-called gifts of the Europeans, widespread plague and epidemic. They were very hard hit by smallpox epidemics, and therefore gradually retreated southward as their numbers declined and their ability to defend themselves declined, and they moved down into areas of now Idaho and that part of the mountain states of the United States. Then you saw groups which we call the Blackfoot Confederacy now. They were actually made up of three allied groups, the Bloods, the Piegans, and the Sissiska. And they originally were from central Saskatchewan, but they very early on got guns through trading with the fur trade posts originating largely out of Hudson Bay, but also the Great Lakes. And with that gun, that gave them an advantage in terms of their hunting ability, so that moved westward where the buffalo were predominated, but also it gave them a technological advantage over more westerly tribes that didn't get the gun, so that gave them, in case of being able to push other people back, gave them a big advantage. And much the same could be said of the Cree, which were also originally a First Nations peoples found in northern Canada, the areas around the Canadian Shield and around the Hudson Bay. But one thing in speaking to all these, there was this gradual western migration, but a lot of that was forced because as the Europeans began to settle eastern Canada and their impacts grew, there really was a massive historical shift of a revolution, so to speak, of peoples, which I don't think we well remember, and that is that gradually as they pushed into eastern North America, it pushed a lot of the first peoples and the Aboriginals westward. And as they became more tightly pushed up against the Rocky Mountains or beyond, then their competition for resources and for space became more intense. And that's where we start to get the era that people often talk about of fighting for territory, fighting for resources, and fighting with each other. Unfortunately, this area became an area of great warfare because you had the Crees, which tended to predominate in central and northern Alberta, and the Blackfoot Confederacy, which predominated in central and southern Alberta, but an intersection and overlap area was around here. So we had some really horrific things happen. There was some very bloody clashes. One was up in north of Red Deer, where a group of Blackfoot attacked a Cree encampment. Father Lacombe, the early Roman Catholic missionary, happened to be there, and so appalled with the ambush and the fighting that he walked out in the dark holding up his crucifix asking them to stop fighting, and which they didn't until a bullet hit him, and the attackers thought that they had killed Lacombe. Fortunately, although he was significantly wounded, he wasn't killed, but only then did the fighting stop and the two sides retreated. Another case was out at Pine Lake. There was a an encampment that was attacked by a war party. All the inhabitants of the encampment were massacred. And when my grandfather first went to the Pine Lake area in 1905, you could still see the remnants of the bones and the massacred tribesmen on that hillside. And it became known as a haunted area. In fact, the original name for Pine Lake is Ghost Pine Lake, because they said the spirits of the massacred people could be still found in the area. But that gets into another area, and that's the spirituality of the area. That's a case of a negative of things, places being haunted and the ghosts of the murdered. But that is misleading, because this was also, maybe because of the abundance of this area, this became a real center of spirituality, religion, if you want to refer to it that way, for the First Nations. There are many sites around here which were very sacred to them. There's Antler Hill and Horn Hill, south and east of Red Deer. We know that for maybe centuries, great piles of animal bones, antlers and horns were piled on those, of significant religious or sacred significance. But because of oral traditions and things, something that we in modern culture scarcely understand and really probably don't understand at all. Another thing that was found in this area are what are known as the medicine wheels, rings of rocks. Now that they're being studied better, they're finding out that they were astronomical, largely in inspiration, that the spokes of these medicine wheels often line up at certain times of the year, the equinoxes and the solstices. So much as we've now discovered with Stonehenge, that they were in fact astrological measure devices as well as sacred sites. And again, much as with Stonehenge, with these medicine wheels, we don't completely understand them in modern states of mind or how we view things, but we do know that they were very important, and we have some, because we've discovered how they lined up astrologically, we have a little better understanding where. Another important spot was west of Sylvan Lake, what's currently known as the Medicine Lodge or Sunset Hills. And those were very significant areas, because a lot of the First Nations would go up there, personal visioning quests, having dreams or things that helped set the life course and help the personal understandings were often done there. They would have sweat lodges or medicine lodges where they would withdraw, become very contemplative, and seek a vision or a quest or some sort of highly significant thing. And that attached to those particular hills. And again, very ancient, not completely understood in modern culture, but a very powerful, millennia old interest, and something that's really quite interesting. So that's really a large part of what we have here, a very rich, scarcely understood and millennia old cultures that mixed here, changed here, adapted here, and in some respects still continue, in that there is a great spirituality. The Aboriginals and First Nations did not disappear, although there are no reserves in and around Red Deer. There are some nearby, but there's also a significant urban Aboriginal population, which, again, I don't think that a lot of people fully understand. They are people that have different life values. They have different ways of looking at their culture, and we need to understand them better.